My neighbor set this sideboard out to the curb for anyone to take, and it's going to be some work. This piece is dated and beat up, but I know it has potential. So keep watching and see what we can transform this into. My name is Sarah, and I like to take things that are ugly and beat up or pulled out of the trash and make them beautiful again. Welcome to my channel. The body of this piece is pretty good. The only messed up parts is one drawer had some nasty stain in it. They all have these felt liners, but one has some type of spill in it that left a nasty stain we'll have to address. And the top of this is also pretty dinged up, scratched up. I mean, somebody legit put scratched an X in the top of this. Like, who does that? So these are all going to need to be addressed, but thankfully the sides and the drawer fronts are just perfect. With any piece of furniture that I flip, I always start with cleaning it. So I'm going to wipe it down with Simple Green, take off the hardware, and try to clunkily pull these felt thingies out. I'm going to see if I can reuse them. I was thinking at first maybe I could just vacuum them up and clean them up, but then I realized the one has the stain mark, and so as long as we can get the drawer cleaned up, I don't need to put a liner back in. I'm not always the biggest fan of these liners, so hopefully we won't need them. So as I clean a piece, I start to think about what I can do with it, what potential it has. And, I always want to do a wood top with something like this, with a desk dresser, buffet like this, because that looks really nice. If you have to paint the rest of it, fine, but if you can get the top to be wood, that's great. But the coating on the top of this was blotchy and it was weird. It was messed up and it was thick. So instead of trying to sand, and I really don't like using stripping agents because it's just so yucky and messy and wet. So I'm using my carbide scraper, and this is just a cheap one from Harbor Freight. I know you can get nice ones. I think they're $30 or $50, maybe more, on Amazon, and they probably work better, but this was working. And there was a learning curve because I haven't scraped that much with this. So I started out in small sections and it was kind of blotchy and I wasn't sure if this was going to work, but I actually got the hang of it and really went to town and got this thing all scraped up. And that's so nice because then it cuts down on how many sanding pads you need to sand it down to get to that bare wood and get that stain out and everything. So once I was happy with how much I got scraped off, got as much as I could, I stayed away from the edges because I didn't want to ding and nick the trim, because as the scraper pulled off, I would start scratching it, and I was like, nope, not good. So I'll just sand that off. So I'm starting with a 120 grit sandpaper, and we're going to go to town, and we're going to sand, and we're going to sand, and we're going to sand, and we're going to get all this red fake cherry color off to expose the real cherry wood color. So I first used the carbide scraper to see if I could get the curved edges scraped off, and I didn't like how that was working out. So I went to the orbital sander and sanded off what I could hit safely, but I didn't want to sand down the crisp corner around the top, so I needed to hand sand those more detailed pieces, and this is a lot of time. It takes a few hours sometimes to sand, and maybe if I had a surf prep it would go faster or something that is better for these curved parts, but I don't, so hand sanding it is. So at this point in the project, I'm thinking I'm going to paint the base and the drawer fronts because I need to fill in the holes and change the hardware. So I'm going to paint the base and I'll stain the top. And I had an inspiration picture, black, it's going to work. I bought the paint, I'm going to paint the base, I'm going to strip the top. But as I was sanding this and looking this piece over and looking at the inside and such, I realized this is solid cherry. Like the back is not cherry, the back straight board, but the rest of this piece is solid cherry. And I deliberated so much because it just pains me to paint beautiful, perfect wood. Like cherry. So I was deliberating. But thankfully I had time to keep deliberating because I needed to fix this X marks the spot patch. I already did my second sanding at 180 grit sandpaper, but before I do the final sanding, I want to address this spot because it will raise the wood and I will need to sand it again. So I over and over and over held this wet rag down, hit it with the hot iron, looked at it, hit it, looked at it, hit it, until I felt like I got it to raise up as best as I could. I hand sanded this just to see how it looked and I felt like it did okay. It's kind of sad when it's wet, it shows up way worse. But then I was able to do the final sanding at 220 grit and get this thing all nice and smooth. And once I got that all cleaned off, dusted off, I decided to do a green wash, which I had never done this before, but I saw this when up too late in the night scrolling through videos. And I thought that is exactly what I need to do with this. I need to green wash it because green tones down red. And the instructions I saw said to water it down 1 part green to 100 parts water. And then just relayer as many times as you feel you need to get it to the right shade. So this was, oh boy, this took a lot out of me emotionally because I didn't want to mess it up and I didn't want to have to sand again. So I put on a wash and then I was like, that's not enough. So I put on another wash, and you're not supposed to wipe this off. Usually with whitewash, you wipe it off. Then I put on another wash and I was like, this is not doing it enough. So I did a thicker wash. Maybe that was the third wash, and put it on, and I finally felt like, okay, I think that has turned it more brown and less red. So I was done with the wash for the top, and I was happy with it. But now I had convinced myself that it would almost be morally wrong to paint the base of this, which I'm joking, of course, but because this is such nice wood, I wanted to preserve it, so I am not going to paint it. So I'm going to set this baby up so I can sand the whole thing. I decided to flip it upside down since the top was already done and take the legs off and get to town sanding. As much as I could, I used my orbital sander, but I had to sand a lot. And again, I started with the 120 grit, worked my way down to up to 180 and then the 220. And I sanded, and I used the orbital sander, and I hand sanded, and I sanded, and I sanded. I think I spent 2 days of sanding. I sanded a lot. Just as a visual, when you start with those big chunkier sandpapers like the 80 or 100 or 120, it takes a lot off, but as you move to that higher grit, it's amazing how much more smooth your wood looks. You can see that in these two pieces. The first one was just sanded once, and the second one had been sanded twice. And just how much nicer things look as you sand. And I can't forget the drawer fronts. I sanded those again, 120, 180, and then to 200. And I was really pleased with what I was finding. This looked so nice. So nice. Now, with the drawers insides, I started to sand a little and then realized, oh, this is going to make a mess because it kind of had some type of a protective layer on it. So I stopped that and decided we'll just use some bleach and see if we can't clean up that stain with that and do minimal sanding on the drawers. The little decorative edges on the drawers I had to do by hand. I could get some of it with the orbital, but it was the same process. Started with the larger grit sandpaper and moved up to the smaller grit sandpaper. And like I said, it's a lot of sanding. I did need to come in and sand a little by hand the drawer where I had already sanded with the orbital sander just to even it out. And then I came in with oxalic acid to try to bleach that stain. And when using it, you first put the oxalic acid on the stained area and then spread it all over the flat surface. The instructions say to reapply every 10 minutes, and I believe I did it 3 times, and I feel it came out pretty good. Now, for the green wash for the rest of the piece, I was pleased with the top, but because I felt like I had to do so many layers, I thought I'll just do a thicker wash and just do one. I thought it was a great idea. So I did all the drawers first because I thought if I messed them up, I could easily sand those down. So I did the drawers first and all the legs. And then I decided I didn't like that. That was too thick. So I watered it down and did a wash on the rest of the piece. Now, the drawers and the legs, once they dried, looked green. And I was like, no. So I sanded them all down. and figured I could do a lighter wash if I need to, or maybe just sanding it would take it back to where it needed. After those were all sanded, I set the legs on top and put the drawers in to look at how the color matched. And I felt like the drawer fronts were too red. The legs I felt were good. So I pulled the drawers out and decided to do one more light wash on those and see how it looked. With the drawers, once the oxalic acid dried, I needed to rinse them out and just wash it down to get the oxalic acid out. I did try some other wash colors, a brown and a white wash, and decided it didn't change the look at all, because at this point I was really stressing over, is it going to look okay if I just put a flat poly top coat on top of this, or is it going to pull some color out I don't like? Is this going to be awful? I don't want to have to resand all this. After sanding for 2 days, the idea of having to sand again sounded traumatizing. So I deliberated a lot over this piece because I'd never done this before. And then the drawers I felt were splotchy, and I just, you could see still the outline of the previous hardware, and I had bought new hardware because I had to keep the holes, which is why I wanted to paint in the first place, was to patch the holes and get new hardware and get over this splotchiness. But I decided to sand again. It actually got the designs out. I was shocked. So it's interesting. Sometimes in life, a problem presents itself and you can be devastated, but actually that problem is the solution to another problem once you fix that problem. So I was like, thank you, Lord, for letting this wash be a problem so I could sand it off, so that I would end up sanding the designs off, and so this would look much better in the end with new hardware. So that makes me feel a lot better when it all works out. So after wiping everything down with a dry towel, I didn't want to get it wet again and raise the wood, but with a dry towel, I was then ready to put on my first coat of polyurethane. Now, I have never used a flat polyurethane, but I chose this because I wanted to have a bare wood look, but this needs to be durable. So after each coat of the polyurethane, I did a light sanding and recoated. I did 3 coats total. Then with the drawers, I was hoping that with the Howard Feed and Wax, it would cover up all the sanding blotchiness that I created, and it did. And this stuff is fantastic to just make your drawers shine. And I make sure to put it on the drawer glides on the bottom side of the drawer and inside of my piece, so that it helps, just make sure everything glides in nicely. Then at this point, I've given this a few days to dry. I actually gave the poly 1 to 2 days to dry between each coat. It's not fully set at this point, but I'm still going to put on the hardware. That will be fine. Ideally, a piece needs to set for like a month almost for the poly top coat to fully set. I did realize here as I'm trying to put everything together that one drawer glide was loose. So I just got some wood glue and clamped it down, and I let that sit overnight, and it was no problem. So now we're ready to put the legs on and bring this piece inside and stage it. And before we go into the final reveal, let's look again at the cherry chunky mess that this piece was. Very outdated. And I hope you guys are excited as I am with how this turned out. It's just beautiful. It just tickles me pink. So thank you for watching this flip. I hope you have enjoyed it, and stick around for the final reveal, but I will catch you in my next video.